When we talk about discourses on housing, we usually draw references from the Western context. It is only in the last few decades that developing countries have come to the forefront of housing dialogues, owing to the growing economies and increasing populations. Today, we take a closer look at the housing market in Kenya, especially in Nairobi. With the support of the Graham Foundation for Advanced Studies in the Fine Arts, we have with us today Kenyan architect Etta Madete, who was the lead researcher for the East Africa section of the Countryside exhibition by Rem Koolhaas. In our conversation today, she talks about the different types of housing typologies in Kenya and how innovative rental products can revolutionize urban housing and make it affordable. I am Vaishnavi Shukla, and this is Architecture Off Center, a podcast where we highlight contemporary discourses that shape the built environment but do not occupy the center stage in our daily lives. We speak to radical designers, thinkers, and changemakers who are deeply engaged in redefining the way we live and interact with the world around us. Etta, I'm very excited to talk about whatever we're going to talk about today, because this is a part of the world and a geography that, for the lack of our searching skills or lack of publications and exposure to the kind of materials available, we've not been exploring as much as we would like to. And so with you, we really want to delve deeper into your work and the broader African context, and of course then pick on specific instances. So before we get into the real nitty-gritties and the details, I thought we can start talking about the housing system that currently exists. Can't be throughout the African context, but if you can broadly just help, initiate us into the world of how is housing, whether it's urban housing or rural housing, and what is the current situation right now when we talk about housing in Africa.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I love talking all things housing, scale, and Africa. And I personally feel it's difficult to look at Africa as one country or one regional context for two reasons. One is because we don't trade directly with each other. The different countries don't trade. There's trade barriers between us. There's language and cultural differences between the major zones, so north, west, east, and south. But generally, our cities and our towns have grown in a very similar way. So there's these trade barriers, maybe a few cultural in terms of the different zones, but the way that we build and we deal with housing and infrastructure and urban development is surprisingly very similar when you go to different African contexts. So in one aspect, we can't really talk when it comes to like how does capital flow, how does trade flow, and that's related to housing and real estate. But we can talk about what I believe is the way we can set up Africa to be ready for that wave of capital that's coming in the next couple of years. So if you look at the way that the way I see it is that there's 4 ranges of housing typologies that you'll find in African countries. And I'm giving an example from Kenya, Nairobi, where I'm from. So you have the urban rental housing. That's very strong. So you have urban rental because people come from the city, they come from the rural areas, they come to the city just for work. In the Kenyan context, they really do have an ancestral home and ancestral land, and they intend to live and retire there. My grandparents, my parents, me, my siblings, we all work in Nairobi, and we know it's going to be a short period of time, and we intend to already begin building our retirement home in our ancestral land. The urban rental can do the full range. You have formal, informal, semi-formal, part-time ownership, rent to own. So the urban rental is very strong and extremely varied. But almost everyone rents, 80% rental within the city. So even if you're in a slum or low income, in a slum or an informal settlement, you're still kind of paying rent to a sort of landlord. It's just because there's no supply of formal housing to house that particular. So it's extremely supply constrained, and the demand is constantly rising faster than supply. I don't think it'll ever catch up. And it hasn't caught up in the West. I don't know whether it'll ever catch up here. So the supply and demand of affordable housing is always at a crosshead. So that's urban rental. Then you have urban home ownership. This is now when either in different income groups as well as real estate developers and other people providing this housing, you find that this is usually either in the outskirts of the cities, similar to how suburbia formed in the West. But you'll find it may not be like suburbia. So it's not like high end. You sort of like you're privileged to go out because you can do the transport there. It's just that land is so expensive in the city that it makes no sense. So if you do want to own home in Nairobi and live in it, own or occupy, not as an investment, you sort of have to go to the outskirts. So that's in my head, urban home ownership. It takes on a completely different form. And I have this sort of philosophy where we keep confusing urban rental propositions for affordability and home ownership propositions for affordability. And those are completely different models. There, you have to think about, if you're talking about affordable, the person must have a car. We don't have the infrastructure that supports those transit. Even the West doesn't. You need to have a car when you move further out from the city. You need to think about what are the amenities that are supporting this move. Where are the kids going? Is it really climate positive? Because it means you're just encouraging a car-centric environment, and there's no infrastructure in the world that can cover the suburbia movement. And that point, it's not even like it's formal good quality housing. It's just you can buy land and build slowly and stop paying rent. So you'll find that even the suburbia context, it's not necessarily good quality, better quality housing. It's just cheaper because the land is cheaper. And to add on to that, the African cities are growing massively. So for example, in Nairobi, our city center maybe had a very small radius. Every 5 to 10 years, this radius expands, and you probably see that as in India. It's going to expand. Yeah. So even when I'm considering agricultural suburbia now, we know where the city is going to grow to into the metropolitan region. We know the infrastructure will come, and we know that the land will become expensive anyway. So even what we are saying is affordable urban suburbia will eventually be part of the city. For example, Nairobi is set to become a mega city in the next 5 years. So it's going to go from 5 million residents, which it is right now, to 10 million in 5 years. So it doesn't matter how, it's not even sprawl, it's just densification and urbanization. So affordability is constantly shifting, even as you move out of the city. Those are the two forms of urban housing options. Let's move further out. Then you just have rural. In the rural areas, and I call rural, and that's what I call it, like the countryside. It's a work that we did with Rem on sort of mapping out the possibilities of an anti-urban future, which is what COVID sort of triggered. And this is what I'm triggering on, is that most people see the urban areas as an employment hub, as a sort of office for a certain bit of time so that you can earn money, educate your kids, and then you're out of there. That happens all over the world, but it's much more ingrained in African culture because you only want to be buried where your ancestors are or where your parents are. So you already have that home established even before you start working. So you don't feel this kinship to, I need to own a home in the city. So there's not much drive and incentive there. So the rural or the countryside or the non-urban, this is usually home ownership. This is usually the size of the house is also supported, not necessarily, it's not a big house per se. I've been to the American South and those houses are huge. It's not a big house. It's a house that is fit for purpose, but it's also supported by things like connected to amenities, kind of, or self-created amenities, or farmland or agricultural support. You find that these houses are a bit bigger, they're a bit much more cozy, there are multiple family generations within them, and they're part of a sort of a communal homestead. And these are usually self-built. They're self-built houses. So you build it over time with small income, and you buy the land or inherit that land. So it's very much ingrained within community. I mentioned those are the three main groups. There's another group which is very rare, which is countryside or non-urban rental. And this is for transit workers that are basically following employment. There's a social category, so social workers. So like you as a doctor employed by the government, you're assigned to this place, this rural or countryside place, and then you basically have this rental non-urban housing is actually a very important thing that needs to be factored in because if you're a transit worker, and as I said, 1 in 4 people in the next by 2050 will be African, and that's workforce. So Africa is going to be literally the highest, biggest workforce in the world.
Mm,
And so workforce housing in a non-urban and an urban context is a small category, but it's growing in consideration. So I
mm.
hope I gave that a nice broad view. But yes.
I think there are a lot of parallels in terms of the city growth that you mentioned. That is a pattern that, of course, India has been witnessing over the decades. So even in my city and a lot of cities that don't have the geographic boundaries of growing, like Mumbai, because it, you know, faces a sea, you can't really grow much. So it grows in a linear fashion across one axis.
Yeah.
Cities like Ahmedabad, where I live, which was at one point one of the fastest growing cities in the world, follows a very similar pattern where it has a historic urban core and then it goes in concentric rings over years, right? So all the villages which are surrounding the city eventually get swallowed by the municipal corporations. And there are instances where those cities will still be like urban villages because they don't
Mm,
move out. So you will have your cows coming out of those urban villages, walking on the road, which is why, the whole image of cows and goats on the road became so popular is because we have those urban villages part of the cities, and then they just keep getting swallowed, and that's pretty much how it goes. So there's a certain kind of densification which happens in the city centers, but that's also that spreading out where you foresee the growth years in advance, you buy land for investment, and then you just
yeah.
go out there and build. But you also drew a lot of examples from the West, and that's something that even in the early stages of the Indian Planning Commission post independence kept on referencing the American, the city beautiful movement. You started looking at satellite cities and garden cities, and then
Mm,
eventually
yeah.
started factoring the idea. Well, we don't really have the suburban context anymore because I mean, public transport is good, is robust within the cities, but if you move that far out, then you'd rather be
Yeah.
driving by yourself because infrastructure has been able to support. Now, of course, you have multi-mode transit systems that are trying to reach out to those areas because that certain
Mm,
kind of growth needs that workforce to support
yeah.
activity. But talking about the Western context and learning from housing in the West and looking at its adaptability in the Kenyan, in the Nigerian context, how do you think over time that learning has been adapted or modified in terms of its adaptability? Because of course we're comparing the West to a developing country where of course economically we're very different, governance wise we are very different, there are issues that nobody foresees that we all have to work on a day-to-day basis, right from corruption to red tape to bureaucracy to nepotism that goes into land at all, allotment and all those kinds of things. What is that translation or transportation, or I don't know what better word, how does that work?
Um, I I love what you've just said, which is first of all the urban villages. That is it's a very hilarious phenomenon. And
Mm-hmm.
it's very lovely. Like we have very high-end neighborhoods in Nairobi where
Mm.
the person is insisting you must rear goats. It's
Yeah,
like
yeah.
and it's in the middle of the city. And that's why I say like Kenyans we always have this anchor in the
So
countryside
just a
because we're
very quick anecdote, because
yeah.
you said that about a decade, 2 decade ago, we had so India after its liberalization, 1991, started getting a lot of foreign capital, right? So liberalized as a part of liberalization, and there's a huge car manufacturer that set up its plant on the outskirts of the city. So a lot of farmers, a lot of cattle herders who own that land suddenly became very rich, very rich. And this is something that a lot of Gujaratis where I'm from, they know this story and they still laugh about it. Is that person, one of the farmers sold their land for some crazy amount of money. And he goes into a car showroom and he wants to buy an Audi, but he doesn't even know how to pronounce an Audi. So he
Oh
says, I want to
wow.
buy a car with four bangles because it looks like there are four bangles.
Yeah.
So in the Gujarati language, it says, I want to buy char bangdi, which is four bangles car, because he doesn't know how to say Audi, but he has the money to buy
He
it.
has the money. He has the money.
But
And
yeah,
and
sorry.
it's this So that's a whole piece of the work that I do, and I'm gonna keep doing. And it is how do we instill land use equity as the cities are growing? We know it's going to become a city. We know it's going to be expensive. And we can see it. I can see where I've built in Nairobi. I can see that my building will get gentrified. And so I need to instill in a way within my systems a way to preserve affordability because the people who need to be in the city cannot afford the houses that we're building, right? So that's a whole other piece. And that's why I say like the urban village concept is an important one. It's to basically say that emerging markets like India, Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, they leapfrog. So like it took 50, 60, 100 years for America to industrialize, to get to where it is. It's leading to the question you asked, to institutionalize. I mean, the great financial crisis in 2008 was nepotism, corruption, confusion, lack of proper systems and governance within the American capital structures. So in my view, I don't think it's very different. I think real estate, housing, economics, they follow the same language and the same historical steps, even as a country is developing. But America, the West, just had a much longer time to get there. And the experiments was so much. Like when you look at different housing policies that America's experimented with, you can see they tried to build the housing, that didn't work. They tried to create associations, those associations became corrupt. They tried to create sort of like, let's just give away money, let's improve social security. And now the minimum wage makes everything so much more expensive that now construction of buildings is ridiculously expensive, making it unaffordable. So there's all these different experiments that have happened, and some that have worked, some that have not. And I I am sitting here, and my grandmother was colonized.
Mm.
So imagine the distance my family has gone from being in a village, my grandmother colonized, educated. She's lived through pre, during, post, and she's still alive now. And I'm here and I'm a middle class Kenyan doing housing, it like coming from America. So like imagine the last 50 years of Africa's growth um, has been compressed in what you describe as 5 or 6 generations in the West. So what this means is that there's an immense opportunity to, first of all, look at the West and see what have they done right, what have they done wrong, what are the things that are similar and not similar, and also be extremely cognizant that we as a continent are not going to go through the same steps. We are 160, 70% digitized. That means that almost everyone has more than one phone, smartphone, all income groups. So it's like we're not going to go through the same steps when it
And that's
comes
something
to
you and Linda talk about in your essay for
yeah.
the countryside as well.
Yeah. It's like we if we see it and we understand it, we will probably do what makes sense to be effective as a country. So that, in my view, sort of gives me a baseline of confidence, and that's why I came here for this sabbatical. I was like, you know what, let me come and just see what happens, because it's easy to read about the West and not actually immerse yourself in the process and then realize actually they are very much the same. The problem I see, and the problem I see is that, first of all, what kind of capital goes into emerging markets? So the kind of capital that goes into building infrastructure and housing and scaling these things are DFIs, or development finance institutions, and they want to follow a very similar model to what the West was doing 50, 60 years ago. So they want the capital to basically come into the continent, and they want governments to build housing. Yet I've just mentioned that government should not be building housing. People have learned this in the West. The government doesn't build any more housing. They enable the private and the public and the social sector to build housing that they help to reduce the demand side subsidies to provide access to the right income groups and solve for market failures, right? So we as the continent, as developing countries, we respond to what capital wants us to do. The biggest capital that's at scale still wants it to be a bit more tangible. They still want to in systems. And so we have two options. One is we need to have the private sector demonstrate alternatives, so at-risk alternatives. And there's lots of players like that that are doing. Like the government right now, its capital comes from a certain place. It has a debt. It has things that they have to do to follow a certain step. That's fine. But the private sector can demonstrate that there's another way and then provide avenues for the government to plug in once the demonstration has happened. The government in all countries are not R&D departments. So the private sector has that role, or the social sector has that role. The second thing is like being aware of the internal capital that is available. So like in the last couple of years, foreign direct investment into Africa, foreign direct investment, actually diaspora remittances surpassed foreign direct investment. It's only a few years ago. What does that mean? It means that people, Kenyans like me who are abroad, remitting money back to the continent, usually for investment, usually because it's a nice currency hedge. When I say currency hedge, it means that they're earning so much and the dollar goes so far that it makes no difference. It's a sunk cost. But the amount of money flowing into including India, is so high. It's now surpassing foreign direct investment, which means that money, if I'm a Kenyan abroad, I know what the money should be doing. I want to use that money and that capital to build or to whatever, et cetera, to invest in it. And it means that money is coming from people who understand the context, understand the risk. So that means that then there's a bit more leeway. So one is private sector demonstration of different scalable models that the government can adopt. The second is, again, it's private sector, but it's more like the capital flows that are not foreign direct investment. You can also look at different capital sources to inspire different forms of infrastructure development and housing development on the continent. But in a simple answer to your question, I came here thinking that I would be like blown away by the America. And I've only been here a year, and I was very impressed with all the stuff that has happened. But the most thing that I was impressed with is that America has tried so many types of solutions to housing. They've tried so many different types of solutions. They've documented it. They have the data. So the best thing we can do is learn from what they did right, what they did wrong, and realize that America was where we were not too long ago. London was where we were. If you look at the pictures of London in the 1950s and 1800s, it's the same as what we sort of think we're suffering from. So you looked at it in the face and realized that all societies go through the same trajectory of development. What is compressed is that we're going through this at the same time as poverty, there's health, the government is doing poverty, health, security, corruption, da 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 da. Me as a housing developer who's focused on affordable housing that's sustainable, I need to focus on, okay, this subsect, how can I do it, demonstrate, and make it easier for the government to scale in future? So there's a lot of opportunity. It's extremely exciting.
Something that I thought was kind of more specific to the American context was also the counter movements that came to affordable housing, stuff like the Not in My Backyard movement, of course, gentrification always was opposed by those who were natively belonging to a place, but also the sheer demand for places to be gentrified, because of whatever rules. And I think those kind of things, at least in an Indian context, are not as frequently seen. The NIMBY movement, things like that, I feel are extremely American, because in Europe, the scenario is very different, right? You have social housing that it's state-sponsored.
Normalized social
It's
housing.
normalized. It's normalized, but it's also done in a really nice way where you have competitions where, the best of the architects participate. They really think of it as not just affordable housing, but kind of extend it to things that larger questions, issues that are more citywide at an urban level, and you really go beyond just housing. It's not limited to that. So I think in that sense, the American counter movements were also, I mean, I had no idea what NIMBY was, and turns out it's a very common word in American classroom when you're talking about housing. It's just not in my backyard, not in my backyard. And it's like, oh, when you're talking about homelessness or housing, that comes in. But since you mentioned that a lot of majority of the housing in urban Nairobi is primarily rental housing, according to you, then what is the most ideal urban housing rental product that can exist, or that does exist, and how do you think that matches up to what the bottom down, the aspirational approach of whoever's going to live there? How does it match up to that?
It's a big question. Just for context, I did develop an entire housing project, aspirationally trying to make it affordable. And 5 years, COVID and recession, inflation later, as a developer, I realized, okay, my houses are affordable in terms of price point, but the price point is not affordable to the majority of the population because the price point is high. And also, we don't have a strong enough mortgage market to support people paying for this and buying these units. So the reason that we are struggling in Nairobi with home ownership or a non-rental model is because our mortgage rate is above 16%. Our base lending rate is at 13%. So until those rates come down,
That's
it doesn't
very
matter how
high.
much money. Yeah, it doesn't matter how much money you have. It doesn't matter. You cannot get a mortgage for a house because it's way too high. But again, I don't know when it was, but it wasn't just in the 1900s, not too long ago, America interest rates were that high. They just went down eventually. So like it always starts that way. It's an issue of risk. It's the debt, but it's been going down, right? There's a lot of controls that are coming, and eventually the rates will come down. But until that happens, it makes zero sense to buy a house unless it's through cash or directly paying the developer to develop it for you. Getting debt as an individual, even myself as a developer, I have to have a very low leverage on my project to enable them to actually pencil out, to make it make sense. So I think the first step is realizing that when you go for an urban rental model, it doesn't mean that you're negating home ownership models. You're just saying that until certain conditions make it possible for home ownership to make sense, then let's think about rental models. I also think rental models also need to be an avenue to help create a deeper credit rating systems in emerging markets. So it's the same in India, it's in most developing countries. We are moving so fast. Our population is not credit worthy at the same time that they need to spend money on credit, right? So you find that the low income or the population that needs housing, that needs credit, that needs access to this are unbanked. Or if they're banked, the bank doesn't see their income that's more informal, that's more sporadic as that. And they're afraid of the banks because then the taxman gets you. So you find that the issue of home ownership, the issue of informality just comes from the fact that we have leapfrogged from rural farming to white collar within 10 years. And you want to expect this person who's now a white collar or blue collar person to also adopt formal systems, which are kind of frayed and fractured. So the informal sector has to be acknowledged as an actual sector. I know we call it informal, formal, semi-formal. It doesn't matter. Almost every single African is semi-formal. Like I have formal systems, I have a job, I have blah, 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 but I also have side jobs, I have investments, I have this, I have this. And informal doesn't mean untaxed or unbanked. It just means not easily visible and data sneaking. And so the rental model is able to absorb all of this. And when I say somebody in a low-income informal slum is paying rent, that just shows you that it's not an issue of whether they can pay or not. And the amount of rent they're paying is actually very similar to formal rental. It's just that the formal rental, they want to put a contract in front of you in English, and they want you to sign something, and they want to pay a deposit, and that's not going to gel well with the way that informality works. So I think the urban rental model that I'm proposing or I'm thinking about is one, it's a gateway to financial security for tenure. And when I say tenure, I also mean rental tenure. Security of having somebody you know who's going to pay your rent and make sure they pay it on time, etc. That's important for the landlord. It's important for the property owner.
Yeah.
Adversely, you as a person who's been paying rent informally and formally for the last 30 years, you should be able to use that income stream or that payment as a way to sort of say, I'm a credit worthy individual,
Yeah.
give me some social security in terms of a line of credit. So that piece, I think, is what urban rental should do. It should begin to formalize informality in any way possible. So I'm advocating for simpler lease documents that are in 2 or 3 different languages,
Yeah.
that are approved by the chief, so that you're not you're this developer who's imposing things on things. No, it needs to come from both ways, just the legal documents. The second is, how do we acknowledge the credit history and waive things like deposits, etc., so that the barrier to entry is different. And I'm not saying waive the deposit altogether. I'm just saying, how can you break it down such that the barrier to entry is not that I have
It's a
a
little more
ridiculous amount,
digestible. Yeah.
more digestible. And then also within that rental process, families grow. You go from one small studio house to another one. So you can basically tell this person, you can rent here for 10 years. And in those 10 years, here's some things I'll put in place to make it easy for you to learn about this real estate world. And let's discuss after 10 years how you can use what you've done for the last 10 years with me, or the developer, or the property owner, and let me plug you into a home ownership plan, right? Because that's the idea, is that you're taking somebody who doesn't understand this world and thinks it's intimidating, it's scary, and including me, it's like, oh, I'm not going to get a mortgage. But like, you rent with me for 4 to 5 years. I can get your history, I can see your track record, and we can use this to tell the bank, this woman should get a mortgage, a good mortgage. And so like Kenya has a mortgage refinancing company that is below, that basically offers mortgages for 8 to 10, 9%. Yeah, that's low. But in the very least, after 8 to 10, 9 years, this woman or this family or this low-income family, they've grown economically. Their kids are now older, they're out of school, etc. They're able to then think about alternative financing options. So I don't even answer your question, but I think urban rental is, it should not be seen as, and it is actually being seen, affordable housing, urban rental is actually a money-making entity. You make so much money because the demand is infinite, and the supply is limited. So you can charge whatever you want to charge. My model is that urban rental needs to be seen within the context of, how do we prepare Africa for this enormous economic growth and urban workforce mobility?
I was going to ask you something else, but I think I'll rephrase it a little bit. I think the way you're talking about it sounds like it ultimately, this model or this product should lead somebody towards the path of home ownership. Now, I think in the last 2 or 3 months, the New York Times has published a couple of studies. They did an article just 2 days ago about the renting versus buying model, and how in certain cities it might be cheaper to rent all your life versus in other cities buy a house, get your mortgage, and be a home owner. Keeping all of that in mind, I actually want to know your views on what you think about tokenization of properties, because that's something that one particular real estate developer in my city has been talking about. Again, it's at a very nascent stage. People are just starting to throw around the tokenization of property. How do you own a share of a property rather than owning all of it, and then that particular share can then be traded when you want to switch up, just like you're
Right.
talking about, from a studio to a 1 bedroom to a 2 bedroom. So how do you tokenize that? Of course, I think it's really too soon to talk about in the Indian context, and I think it's too soon to talk about in any developing country context. But do you think a product like that would work in the affordable market, maybe more than it does in the luxury market? Or do you think it sticks around in, again, today, New York Times published that even though the GDP of Pakistan is 1/10, I think 1/10 that of India, uh, Pakistanis own about $11 billion worth of property in Dubai, luxury property.
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
Yeah, it's a huge thing talking about, how money is saturated
Mm,
at the top tier and how that money is never invested back into the country but invested elsewhere. And so
mm.
in terms of thinking about tokenization, I just think maybe if there was a way, I don't know how one would make it more accessible, but could work in an affordable market where you're able to trade those tokens to, move up or shift gears, or I don't know. Just your thoughts on that.
No, I love the idea of tokenization, of breaking down this idea of owning a home to make it make sense. I think there's like 3 or 4 companies in Kenya that are experimenting with that, and there's one that's using Bitcoin, which then just goes over my head.
Yeah, it's on
Um,
blockchain.
and
Yeah.
then and then it's on blockchain. And then others, which is actually like, how do we turn your rental payment into points that you build out to then qualify or transfer, etc. And it kind of works well within an existing, let's say you own a whole bunch of homes, and then there are different types of homes. So you can be able to sort of do that transfer, right?
Mm.
And I think the biggest barrier I see with this is that the people you're trying to help, usually it's just too complex to be able to then explain. Like, there has to be
Yeah.
like, is it
Yeah.
red? Is it open? Like, what are you signing? And also then people can take advantage of that. So I I think, onto your first point, you mentioned that you sort of see urban rental as a way to home ownership. I think what I'm trying to say is that urban rental should be a way onto creating financial security for all
Mm.
income groups.
Mm.
How you define financial security is neither here nor there. I don't actually want to own an apartment and live in it in Nairobi, because I want to be flexible. And like, I can. I want to be flexible. But I do own investment properties. That makes
Mm.
sense to me.
Mm.
Um, and because I managed my rent, then it means I can, so like my rental properties can then pay for where I
Offset for
want.
your, yeah.
Yeah. So I and all the housing that I will own will probably be either in Western, where my parents are and my in-laws are, or on the coast, which is a nice beachfront property. So, and I think that's an okay thing to make. And it's an okay assumption to make for low income communities as well. They don't want to invest in the house. They want to, the first windfall they get, they clear, make sure the kids are educated. That's the first thing they invest in. The second is they get a car.
Mm.
So even before they upgrade their house, many times they get the cheapest car on the market. So like, the way that aspirations are implanted on low income from either higher income people or educated people who are trying to help is usually misconstrued. And that's why I think urban rental provides that sort of leeway. Like, do you want to own a home? I can help you with that. Do you want to upgrade your home? And like, let's say you ask a family, in 5 years, do you want to then think through how I can move to a 2-bedroom rental? Like, that's a question. Like, do you know how much that is? How do you backtrack in? How do you back into it? Um, so, and there's a company that's doing that. Their whole point is housing as investment opportunities for financial security. But I think the way I see it is a little bit different, because I feel there's this sort of social imperative that affordable housing developers need to have to end users, which just gets blown out of the window because, as I said, I built affordable housing in this area and it's affordable now. But
Yeah.
because I built quality, sustainable, it's green, it's going to be literally gentrified immediately. How do I control that if I'm not the owner of each unit? I mean, there's a lot of condo models in Kenya. So so yeah, and like, you have to have a subset who are just behaving the same way that they behave in Europe, where they have a social mandate. But they are a for-profit entity that
Yeah.
makes money, but they have a social mandate to preserve affordability, and then use that preservation of affordability not to give away. So my model is that it's only for 8 years while your kid is in a public primary school. We provide a rental subsidy, and in those 8 years, after the kid leaves primary school, it means that then that subsidy needs to go to somebody else, somebody who new is coming into the city who doesn't have the money. And then the 8 years, you need to encourage economic mobility, because we have to shift in emerging economies. We have to shift from the you will be given, if you're needy, you will be given forever. That's not teaching a man to fish. You need to be able to sort of recycle that social impact so that you can have a wider spread, but also, be sensitive to the fact that yes, things can happen, But if you start from the beginning, 8 years is a long time. 8 years, we can basically make a low-income family stable. And many times they do that all by themselves. So the the housing sector, the affordable housing sector, especially with all the energy it's facing right now,
Yeah.
because everyone has run away from office, everyone has run away from retail, everyone is scared. So everyone is now an affordable housing developer, which is fine. But if you really are going to drive this idea of affordability, we need to be much more conscious of what does this mean in the long run. And I believe in for-profit mixed income. Again, learning from the West, concentrated poverty doesn't work. It doesn't work. And it doesn't need to happen in emerging markets. I've been to Mumbai. Like, I am middle class, not by chance. Yes, it was educated, but like, let's say in our family tree, there's like this line is middle class, this line is high class, this one is so like my cousins, there's some of them that are below the poverty line. I have extremely wealthy uncles, and it doesn't necessarily cross-pollinate, but it's like we in emerging economies, we all income groups interact with each other very amicably.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
the NIMBYism, I don't think NIMBYism the only NIMBYism that happens is actually if you bring like a very noisy club next to like a school or residential area. So that's just mean. And that's just land use zoning. But like we're not yet and I'm in Cambridge. We're not yet in this kind of environment where, it's like, oh,
Yeah.
it's low income person is lazy. No, low income people in Africa they're not lazy. They're actually the most hardworking people.
Hardworking. Yeah.
They're hardworking, they're hungry, they're eager, and they will actually go through economic mobility within 5 to 8 years. They will. There's no doubt about that. It's usually like when people get rich, that's when they become lazy
Yeah.
and confused and confused. And so we have to reframe how we are helping. And I'm saying this because I made the mistake. I made the sort of assumption that if I build it, they will come and it will remain affordable. That's not true. And I have to fix that in our next project. So all of this work, the work I do is, and I'm blessed because I'm a doer and a thinker. I like getting my hands dirty. I'll build it. I'll be like, okay, let's just do it. We've raised the money. Let's just go and build it. Then we step back and be like, what have we built? What have we done? Let's assess it. And then the next project, let's do it a little bit better. Let's incrementally improve. And there's infinite possibilities because it's Africa. There's like the room for experimentation, the capacity of the government to support people to help social issues, the fact that the people you're helping are hungry, they're eager, they're willing, they want to be helped, but not to be smothered. So like, and like you have to give them that benefit of the doubt. Like if you want to help somebody, you need to be like, I want to help you up until this point, and then the rest you should help yourself.
Yeah.
And eventually you should not need me to help you. You should be helping somebody else, right? And so I think growing up in that kind of context, as well as I grew up abroad, I grew up traveling, has given me a very different perspective about how do we see what we call low income, especially because, as I said, I hang out, I spend time with people within these sectors, and it's not because they don't want money. It's just the
Yeah.
economy is not favoring them. So yeah.
Yeah, just two quick thoughts I had on that because you mentioned NIMBYism. I think the closest that comes to having witnessed NIMBYism in my city is we are a staunch there's a lot of Jains, which is a community in India that doesn't eat onion, garlic. They don't believe in killing animals. And this, the first time we had KFC open here, there was a huge uproar because people were like, I don't want a KFC in my neighborhood. You won't want to live near places where there's a butcher, for example, to the extent where even like very, very upscale properties, if a developer has a certain religious inclination, for example, they will not allow restaurants in the building to serve non-vegetarian food, so it's
Religious and food.
yeah, it's very nuanced. And something else that also happens in the Indian context is there's a combination of affordable housing. So there's privately developed affordable housing, but there's also government housing. And then a lot of times in the name of development, when slums are cleared and they are given alternate housing by the government, a lot of people, in fact, end up taking that apartment, renting it out, and choosing to live on the street. So a lot of
It's a
subletting also.
phenomenon, and it's that mentality where, again, just increasing supply does not reduce informal supply.
Yeah.
That's not going to happen. And my belief is that you increase supply and you reduce barriers to entry to formal supply, because somebody will come into the country and they will compare you to the slum or the street. That's the math they've done. And because it's a tropical country, I can see why it doesn't work here, because in Boston you will not survive the winter.
Yeah, it's cold.
But in you can literally just go and you can set it up and you'll be okay.
Yeah.
So dealing with, and that's why I think the NIMBYism doesn't work, because the alternative is an empty lot, it's insecurity, it's a slum forming, it's, the uproar would be, why are you not using this property to develop, right? And so we really have to be conscious of the fact that, first of all, just increasing supply does not mean that you're sorting out the affordability issue. The number of people coming into the cities is just too much. What you have to do is, every new person that enters the city, you need to give them a choice. You need to give them a choice, and they need to start choosing the formal supply. That's once you start doing that, somebody new comes into the city and they choose the formal supply because it meets their needs. And what are their needs? A little bit of flexibility, a little bit of the price point has to be right, the location has to be right. So how do we make this? And for me, it's like there's a sunk cost in the ones that are already in the city, in the slum. Those ones will move when it's time, eventually. And usually they move when they become more wealthy. And when they become more wealthy, they retire to the countryside. It's their kids that then get into formal. But the new entrant, and when I was describing the different urban rental, there is semi-formal rental. It looks like normal rental. It's just semi-formal because the guy doesn't expect you to sign a lease, or it's a bit more fluid. There is informal houses that it's a building. It's an actual building. They just didn't follow the permitting process. So it's just an unsafe building, but it's a building. And my formal supply is competing with this informal supply. It's not competing necessarily with the slum, because that's another segment, which is actually rental. So, and it's as I said, it's purely because of leapfrogging. You have an entire continent that has gone from being villaged to being colonized to the AI internet age within one generation. So you'll find that everyone is in different spectrum, but everyone has all the same information on opportunity, on access. And so the way that we approach housing should be through information, through data, through access. And then you let the market decide, and you'll find that the market always decides what's better as long as it meets their needs.
Last question. So you're on your sabbatical, and whenever you get back, what is next for you?
I'm visiting Nairobi in 2 weeks, and I'm already building up like the next plans. But it's really connected to the work that the kind of sort of thinking that I've been sharing in this session. How do we keep supplying? Let's all keep supplying. We have to improve supply, and there's so many market players that are just supplying housing, and I respect that. Let us think about demand side needs on preserving affordability. So you have supply, just keep increasing. We have a huge deficit. I'm going to keep supplying. Everyone needs to keep supplying. But we need to connect that with the end users. How are we creating this economic mobility, either through rental, home ownership, rent-owned tokenization, etc.? How are these developers? Because the people who then control the price of the unit, who goes in there, how the property is managed and structures, are the developers. But the developers want to just develop. They just want to supply. So I have this mapping that I'm doing, which is basically saying there's demand and there's supply, developers, there's demand, the end users, the people who are living in the units. And if we just assume that eventually they'll meet, it'll never happen. You'll have these guys choosing what they want, these guys putting price points that are not accessible, putting legal documents, and just picking the highest price in the market, which if it's gentrified, it doesn't really matter. So what you need is to start developing this middle, the middle portion. And this is a normal phenomenon in markets. It's called the two-sided marketplaces. Two-sided marketplaces, supply and demand. You have to have a middle person who's basically an intermediary. This intermediary is not necessarily the government. This intermediary is somebody who then owns and has this housing within their portfolio, but then is also ensuring that, yes, you're getting your returns and your rental, but you're also making sure that if it's an affordable housing intermediary, that you're creating affordable solutions that are actually available to the people who are on this other side. In Europe, it is the government. In the US, you find that many social CDCs, community development corporations, play that role. In growth markets, you just don't think about it because everyone is just scrambling to supply or scrambling to help the low income earn more. So I think there's that role of that intermediary. So for me, I want to research what does that look like, and what does that entity look like, and build that sort of entity and scale through that. The second thing is this piece on creating a proper systemic solution to future land use inequity. And I think it's a very simple thing. So like if you look in the States or in Europe, there's like land use zoning that ensures that there's a certain density of housing that's affordable within certain areas. But they did that after the fact because they realized that as a city and a country develops, there's nothing you can do. It's no longer affordable, even if it was intended to be affordable. So in addition to having these institutions, these guardian institutions that preserve affordability, think about churches and community groups. Those like community centers in a city or a town or churches, those are essentially stewards of care, right? And so the housing sector and the affordable housing sector needs stewards of care that basically are ensuring that there's preservation of affordability even as we are urbanizing. And we also need there to be some rules in these areas where the city is growing. Let's say where we're building in Kiambu, like the land prices, etc., will govern how affordable this area is in the next 15 years. And it's not that long in advance. So can we land bank and just say we will preserve 10% of the housing here for that's preserved affordability? Like we just do it in advance. And we tell the government around these public primary schools or around secondary schools or around churches or around hospitals, just create a zone where there's a certain percent requirement. And it's a very simple thing to think about. But like in my head, we can do that now in Kenya, in Africa. We can do it right now because that land is agricultural. It's not yet there, but the government is building roads. The government is gentrifying. The government is expanding. So those two pieces of work, how do we create that middle person who's helping supply and demand normalize? Think of like Uber. Uber is a platform, right? When Uber came into the market, even in Kenya, the taxi drivers stopped charging us so much because it's like the supply guys who are demanding. There's infinite competition. It normalized the market. Same as Airbnb. Hotels are like, okay, fine, we will listen to what you guys want. So it's the same with housing. So demand and supply has to have a middle person who's that steward of passing information, or not. You just need a middle person. And the second is planning for land use inequity, which the West has retrogressively instilled, which Africa has the opportunity to do now. So that's what I'm gonna do through Zima, through my housing company. And I'll have an office in the West, so either in London, New York, or Boston, and then keep building and building in Nairobi. So I'll be flipping between the two offices.
That is incredible. Thank you so much for your time, and I wish you all the best for all the cool things you do once you finish the program.
It's gonna be exciting, and I'm really looking forward to it. It's not too far, just a few weeks. I'll be back into it and digging myself into solving these problems. Thank you so much for your time.
Special thanks to Ayushi Thakur for the research and design support, and Kahan Shah for the background score. You can follow us on Instagram at arcofcenter and reach out to us through our website arcofcenter.com. That is ARCHOFFCEN And thanks for listening.